webinar 223 or watching on the live stream. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speaker, Clay Tabor from the University of Connecticut. Clay began his academic career at the University of North Carolina at Asheville with a degree in atmospheric sciences. He then moved on to the University of Michigan, where he began working on paleoclimate modeling with Chris Paulson. After a postdoc at NCAR, he's now in the Department of Geography at UConn, the University of Connecticut. And today he'll talk to us about some work he's done exploring the climatic response to impact event. So Clay?
Okay. Thanks, Tony. Thanks everyone for being here. So I just want to talk a bit today about using Earth system models to try and better understand the climatic consequences of this devastating impact event at the end of the Cretaceous here. And this is work I've done in collaboration with several people at the National Center for Atmospheric Research and the University of Colorado. So just a quick outline of what I'll be talking about. I realize there's quite a lot of different backgrounds in the audience, so I'll give a bit of background information on the Cretaceous and how we set up these models to really try and simulate these extreme perturbations. I'll follow that up with some results, mainly focusing on the radiative temperature and precipitation responses. And finally, I'll do a little bit of a summary, conclusion, and some future outlook of where we're kind of headed with this work going forward. All right, so the overall goal of this project is to really better understand the end-Cretaceous mass extinction. And there's been a lot of interest in mass extinctions recently because of this rapid decline in biodiversity we are experiencing in present day. And there's been a lot of people trying to see if we can gather any information from these past extinctions about our current extinction and about recovery times of biodiversity. But I think in order to really try and make any of these claims and these analogies, we really need to know the causes and the mechanisms driving these past extinction events. And so I'm going to be exploring the end-Cretaceous, and in particular the end-Cretaceous impact event, the Chicxulub Impact event, and its impacts on the climate system. And even more focused, in this talk I'll be really looking at the causes and consequences of the impact winter driven by the impact event. So just a little bit of background information. The end-Cretaceous mass extinction occurred 66 million years ago at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. It's estimated that about 75% of all species went extinct across this boundary. It's obviously famous for killing off the dinosaurs, but many other things also went extinct at this time. And this boundary is coincident with a asteroid impact, the Chicxulub Impact event. But it's also occurred right around the same time as some large igneous province volcanism. So the Deccan traps were erupting over the Indian subcontinent at this time, and there's been a lot of debate in the community about what really led to this mass extinction. Could it all have been driven by an impact, or was it somewhat driven by volcanism, or all driven by volcanism? There's still a lot of debate within the community about the mechanisms. And so I'm trying to get at this here by looking at a small part of the aerosol responses to the impactor. So the impact occurred 66 million years ago, and it was first hypothesized that an impact might have been important for the end-Cretaceous mass extinction when Alvarez and others found an iridium layer around the globe that was all deposited right around the same period of time. And so this was first hypothesized around 1980, and iridium's a fairly rare it's fairly rare on Earth, but it's fairly common in asteroids. And so if you have a deposit that's found all around the globe, it suggests that there was probably a very large asteroid impact at that time. However, it wasn't for another decade or so until the early 90s when they actually found the impact site to kind of validate this hypothesis. And it turned out it was in the Yucatan Peninsula. It's about 180 kilometers kilometers in diameter. And from that information, and as well as some recent drilling efforts, it's suggested that the impactor was about 10 kilometers in diameter. So fairly significant impact, could have led to a lot of devastating consequences for life on Earth. So as you might expect, many things happened very rapidly after this impact event. It was a shallow sea impact site. So in the latest Cretaceous, the Yucatan Peninsula was under maybe about 500 meters of water. And so there would have been mega tsunamis associated with this reaching well into the interior of North America, and there's some evidence for that in sediment beds. It also would have triggered extreme earthquakes and volcanism. And in fact, there's been some recent hypotheses put forth that the Deccan Traps volcanism actually could have been invigorated by this impact. So actually transferring the energy through the Earth and leading to increased volcanism, kind of this 1-2 punch hypothesis for leading to the extinction. The impact event also ejected a whole bunch of material that reached into the upper atmosphere and even some of it escaping into space. But as a lot of that material condensed and fell back to Earth, it led to frictional heating that would have led to a thermal pulse on the surface, almost as broiling the surface of the Earth, which could have obviously killed off a lot of life and also potentially led to widespread fires soon after the impact. And all these things would have been extremely devastating to life on Earth, particularly near the location of the impact. But all we're really focusing on today is the emissions from the impact event and how they might have impacted life on Earth. And so there's quite a few emissions that would have occurred with this impactor. There would have been sulfur emissions, dust emissions from the impactor and impact site, as well as some greenhouse gases, particularly CO2 from vaporized carbonate, some halogens being emitted from the seawater itself, and potentially quite a bit of soot from these fires due to this thermal pulse. And all of these could have had a wide range of consequences for the Earth system. For instance, you could have a blocking of sunlight leading to less vegetation, less primary productivity. It also could have led to cooler temperatures, as you might expect. The halogens would have led to a destruction of ozone, potentially allowing more UV radiation at the surface. And finally, things like sulfur emissions could have led to a bout of extreme acid rain and acidification of things like the ocean surface. None of which is particularly good for life. All right. Unfortunately, there aren't very many records that really capture this event. So even though it's hypothesized that it would have been a very extreme climate perturbation for many different reasons, it was also fairly abrupt. And so there really aren't many proxies out there that can have that type of temporal resolution, especially this far back in time. In addition, a lot of the proxies that are used to try and reconstruct past temperature, et cetera, went extinct across the boundary. So you don't have this continuous record across the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. That said, there is a few Tex 86 sea surface temperature reconstructions that claim to capture the few years right after the impact event. And this is one here from the Gulf of Mexico region showing fairly warm temperatures in the sea surface right before the impactor, and then this period which they're claiming is annually resolved temperature for the first few years after the impact event, suggesting maybe about 7 degrees of cooling within a few years after the impact, and then temperatures returning to normal relatively quickly, maybe a degree or so warmer than before the impact going forward, potentially due to some type of CO2 increase. And the authors of this study based their explanation on several other theoretical studies that have been done before, which is that this rapid cooling was this impact winter driven by these aerosol emissions from the impactor and the impact site. All right, so before I dive into some of the results, some of our modeling work, I want to take a step back and kind of explore what the Cretaceous was like and how we really set up these simulations for understanding the past. So Cretaceous climate was fairly warm overall compared to modern day climate. It's thought that throughout the majority of the Cretaceous period, there weren't really any large ice sheets at either hemisphere. And in particular in the middle Cretaceous, so here's a plot showing the past 120 million years or so, going from 120 on the right to present day on the left over here. And this is delta 18O of the benthic foraminifera, so it's more or less recording a temperature signal, but also ice volume in the later record. And here around 100 million years ago is this middle Cretaceous period, known for its extreme warmth. This is actually an artist's reconstruction based on fossil evidence from Antarctica around this time period. So very warm climate. As we head in towards the latest Cretaceous, so this is the period when the impact occurred, a period known as the Maastrichtian, things have cooled off quite a bit. So you're going from this extremely warm period down to this cooler period here. But compared to present day, it's still quite warm during this period of time. So we still have no or minimal ice sheets, a reduced latitudinal temperature gradient due to several different feedbacks within the system. And finally, it seems like biodiversity was doing fairly well at this period of time. So early on, there had been some studies suggesting that biodiversity was maybe already in decline in the latest Cretaceous. But a lot of the more recent evidence suggests that things were doing quite well up until the boundary. And so maybe a more abrupt event than previous studies had suggested. All right, so I won't go into too much detail about model setup, but this is where I spend the most of my time. So I'll quickly go over kind of how we configure the model for these extreme perturbations as well as for these deep time climate states. So the model we're using here is the Community Earth System model. It was developed at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and it's a fully coupled Earth system model including dynamic atmosphere, ocean, land, sea ice, and runoff components all held together through a coupler. And in this case, I'm using a 2-degree atmosphere and land configuration in combination with a nominal 1-degree ocean and sea ice configuration. And we need to change a lot of things, especially when we go into what we're calling deep time climate, where our continental configuration is very different than present day. So we need to change the land sea mask, we need to change atmospheric composition, insulation, aerosols, you name it, a whole bunch of different things all need to be modified, and it's not terribly easy to do so most of the time. So in this case, we're using Maastrichtian boundary conditions. This is representative of about 66 million years ago. This is a detailed reconstruction of topography and bathymetry from the time period. And it's obviously quite different than present day. So even though tectonics really move around at about the growth of your fingernail per year over 66 million years, that's quite a long period of time. And so some differences you might notice is at this time the Atlantic was much more restricted and smaller than it is today. Your Tasmanian Seaway is shut off. You have a Western Interior Seaway still somewhat present in the US. And sea level is generally a bit higher at this time period, in large part because of the change in, or the lack of ice sheets, as well as seafloor spreading rate differences. So these changes alone can lead to some fairly different climate state than we have in present day. Add in addition to that, the difference in atmospheric composition. So as you might expect, CO2 was thought to be elevated at this time. But I just want to highlight that there is very large uncertainty in the CO2 reconstructions from this period of time. So here I'm showing a compilation of reconstructions for the late Cretaceous. And I'm going from 100 to 60 million years ago, and I have CO2 concentration estimates from different proxies on the y-axis here. And it's a huge mess, right? So there's a lot of uncertainties here, but we can kind of do some model proxy comparison to try and narrow down where we think it is, or at least based on our model sensitivity, and also where kind of the average is for this latest Cretaceous in Cretaceous period, which is around 500, in which case we use 560 ppm CO2. I will say that there's this really high value up here, which is really this thought to be post-impact CO2 reconstruction, suggesting a really large increase associated with vaporized carbonate rock. But there's a new paper that came out within the past month suggesting that that was a real overestimate, and they've revised it down to only a few hundred ppm increase associated with the impact, potentially due to burning of biomass. All right, so the boundary conditions, we also need to change those. So in the model we have vegetation that can grow or die, so it has carbon and nitrogen cycling. So if a particular vegetation type isn't happy with its particular climate, it can die off. Vice versa, it can thrive in certain conditions, but it can't change dynamically. So we can't have the transition from, say, a boreal forest to savanna. And so we need to prescribe the vegetation types. And so in this case, we are using a reconstruction based on fossil evidence from the end of the Cretaceous. All right, and so we need to make several other adjustments as well, and I won't bore you with all the details, but we need to adjust things like the solar constant, about 1% change per 100 million years. We adjusted the aerosols to make these kind of zonally symmetric forcings. and we modified things like the soil type. And because we don't know our initial ocean conditions, we need to spin up this simulation for quite a long period of time. And so we ran this simulation for over 2,000 years to try and get a more or less equilibrium climate state. And this is the climate that we get as a result. This is just the surface temperature response. All right, so we've done some previous work trying to compare our simulations with some sea surface temperature proxy reconstructions. And so here I'm just showing latitudinal 35-meter temperature from our simulation compared with some sea surface temperature proxy reconstructions. And there's a lot of noise here, but some of these really cool low latitude temperature reconstructions can probably be ignored. It's been found that they're actually diagenetically altered, and so probably aren't recording a true sea surface temperature estimate. And so the hottest temperatures are oftentimes taken to be the more reliable ones, the more pristine proxies. And in that case, the model and the proxies agreeing to first order as well as we can expect with all the uncertainties in these different aspects. All right, so moving on to the end-Cretaceous mass extinction finally. So what caused this impact winter? Well, in order to do this, we need to change some of our model configuration. And so what I didn't mention is the default configuration of the Community Earth System model. The atmosphere only extends into the middle stratosphere. And this is fine for most applications. Most of the weather is occurring in the troposphere, of course. But when we have these large ejections of aerosols that reach into the upper levels of the atmosphere, we really need to have something that can simulate these upper levels of the atmosphere. And so we transitioned our model configuration from using CAM, or this low top atmosphere, to this high top atmosphere configuration known as WACM. And so this can resolve up into the thermosphere. And we also coupled it with this KARMA aerosol model that allows us to explicitly resolve the aerosols being emitted from the impact site. And what's unique about the KARMA aerosol model is it actually allows the aerosol size to evolve freely, which is really important when we have very high density of aerosols within a small area. So it allows them to coagulate and deposit out. And here we'll be focusing on a few different scenarios looking at the aerosol emissions. These are the most likely drivers of an impact winter involving soot, SO2, and dust. So soot, in this case, we're basing it on sedimentological evidence that there's widespread deposition of soot right around the time of the boundary, suggesting widespread fires. And this is coming from the estimates of Wendy Walbach and others around 1990. And then there's a recent effort to drill into the impact site, and they came up with some new estimates for sulfur emissions from the impactor and impact site. And so we're using the latest estimate for that here. And finally, dust particles from the impactor and impact site are coming from a recent compilation effort as well and reanalysis. And so we're using the latest estimates we can to try and look at these different impact emission scenarios. And we're looking at them individually. So we're looking at the soot, we're looking at the SO2, and we're looking at the dust separately. So emissions can come from different sources. The majority of the soot in this case is coming from fires. So this is the black carbon being emitted from these potentially widespread fires associated with this thermal pulse. And we're emitting all fire emissions around the tropopause as a Gaussian distribution there. We also have splashed emissions from the impactor. So this is put in a column vertically right around the impact site. And then we have ballistically emitted material, stuff that reached into the upper atmosphere and covered the globe relatively quickly. And we're emitting them globally at around 50 kilometers. And in all these situations, we're emitting over the course of a single day. All right. So moving on to some of the results of our simulations. Here I'm showing concentration of aerosols through time for the 3 different emission scenarios. And so it's from the time of impact, starting at year 0 here and moving 10 years out into the future. And this is average values through the atmospheric column. So we have elevation here on the y-axis. And I'm showing it for soot, sulfuric acid as produced due to the SO2 emission, and dust concentrations. So what you can see here in this first plot is that even though the soot's being initially emitted around the tropopause, it quickly fills the entire atmospheric column and then begins to gradually settle out as it accumulates, produces larger particles, and begins to settle out mainly gravitationally. However, there's a wet deposition feedback around year 6 that leads to the removal of the remaining soot relatively quickly, and I'll talk about that feedback in the next few slides. In the middle plot here, I have the sulfuric acid concentrations through time, and it has a relatively long residence time in the atmosphere. And this is because we're emitting so much SO2 that we just don't have enough OH and H2O to really convert it all really quickly, and so some of it can stick around for quite a long period of time. And finally, the dust, even though we're emitting more dust into the atmosphere than anything else, it has a relatively short residence time. So it's able to coagulate fairly quickly. It doesn't have some of the properties that soot does in terms of keeping it lofted in the atmosphere, and it tends to fall out within a few years' time. All right, so here I'm just going to show a kind of interesting series of feedbacks involving the soot that I think kind of highlights the importance of using some of these complex models to understand these extreme perturbations and feedbacks that you might not expect or get with models that aren't actually explicitly simulating the aerosols. So here I have the soot concentration again, as showed in the previous slide. And what I didn't mention is that even though you're emitting at the tropopause, it's able to loft into the upper atmosphere because soot's a very good absorber of shortwave radiation. So the shortwave radiation comes in, gets absorbed by the soot, and then re-emitted, and actually is able to heat the surrounding atmosphere and loft that soot, or at least a good portion of it, up into the upper levels of the atmosphere. And then, as I mentioned, it's able to settle out gravitationally through time, and then abruptly deposit out around year 6. So why is that abrupt deposit occurring? Well, it involves a series of feedbacks. First, when you have the soot being this very good absorber of the shortwave radiation, it's able to heat the atmosphere, and that's part of the reason why it gets self-lofted up into the upper levels of the atmosphere. So here I'm just showing temperature through time of the atmospheric column, and you can see that the soot is significantly heating the upper atmosphere, and that heating gradually goes into the lower levels of the atmosphere. And in doing so, it removes the cold trap that's typically in place in the stratosphere. And so you remove that cold trap, and that allows water vapor to actually reach into the upper levels of the atmosphere. And so if we look at the water vapor concentrations through time, and this third plot plotted the same way, you can see that over time with the emission of soot, you get more and more water vapor reaching into the upper levels of the atmosphere. And so as you might expect, as this temperature is gradually cooling off at the atmospheric column due to the removal of the soot, and you're getting more and more water vapor into the column, eventually you're going to reach saturation. And this occurs fairly quickly throughout the globe. And so here I'm showing relative humidity through time. And so right at around year 6, you get this hydration event, and the water vapor condenses, and in doing so it condenses onto these soot particles and actually rains out the majority of the remaining soot quickly from the atmosphere. And so this is what's occurring here, this wet deposition of the soot due to the condensation of the water vapor. And what was really surprising about some of this results and some sensitivity tests we had done is that if you actually emit less soot into the atmosphere, it takes a longer time for this feedback to occur, and you actually get more cooling from a smaller emission of soot because it's still blocking the majority of the sunlight. And vice versa, if you emitted more soot, this feedback occurs more quickly and you get this wet deposition earlier on. And I won't go through the same process for the SO2 and the dust emissions, but we really don't get this same type of response from them. The heating stays higher in the atmosphere with the SO2 emissions. You don't get the removal of the cold trap. Water vapor stays where it should in the lower levels of the atmosphere, and you don't really have that wet deposition. And the dust likewise settles out much more quickly, in this case because dust isn't nearly as good of an absorber of this shortwave radiation, so it can't self-loft. It just clumps together and quickly deposits out. All right, so moving on to some of the radiative responses and how it might affect life on Earth. Here I'm showing the % change in surface shortwave radiation from these different emission scenarios, going out 20 years into the future from the time of the impact. And the dust is in red here, the SO2 is in blue, and the soot is in black. And just a few things to point out here is overall in terms of the net reduction in surface shortwave radiation, soot has the largest impact. Whereas you can tell that dust has a fairly short-lived impact, but also a fairly strong one just due to the large amount of dust put into the atmosphere. Whereas SO2 and the sulfuric acid it creates has a smaller impact, although still a very extreme reduction in surface shortwave radiation. Overall, it's significantly smaller, and this is because as you emit more and more SO2, as it becomes sulfuric acid, the sulfuric acid particles become larger, and actually their radiative effects become less. So it's somewhat self-limiting in the atmosphere. So if we look more closely, though, in this case we're looking at the first 200 days after impact of the surface shortwave response, we actually see some kind of interesting distinctions between these different scenarios. So that we're on a log scale here. And what you can see with the soot is that even though you get very low light levels, you're never actually getting to complete darkness. You're not getting to blackout conditions. And so even though humans would not be able to see at all in these type of conditions, this is equivalent to a moonless night, some of the nocturnal animals that were alive at that time might have been able to survive in these type of conditions. They might have still been able to see. Whereas if you compare this to dust, even though the dust response lasts for a fairly short period of time, there is a period of almost 10 days where temperatures were more or less, or light was more or less completely blocked. And so even nocturnal animals wouldn't be able to see in these conditions. Okay. So trying to relate this a bit more to how it may have impacted life on Earth, here I'm showing the number of days compared to the pre-impact climatology where light levels were less than 1% of normal. And a few things to point out here is one, this scale bar is going from warm to cool colors. The cool color is showing more days with light levels below 1% of normal. And this soot plot shows that in many locations you're getting well over a year with light levels below 1% of normal. I should say that we chose a 1% of normal value because it's kind of a rough empirical relationship of where you can have photosynthetic activity. And so when you're below 1% of normal, we consider this areas where photosynthetic activity probably wasn't occurring in this time period. So upwards of 2 years in some places on Earth due to the soot emissions where photosynthesis was not happening. In contrast, even though we reduced surface light quite a bit with the SO2 emissions and the sulfuric acid that it creates, we're never producing low enough light levels to prevent photosynthesis anywhere on Earth. So obviously photosynthesis would be limited, but not stopped completely. And finally, if we look at the dust response, we're getting about a month or so of reduced light below the photosynthetic threshold. So obviously a disruption, but maybe not enough to lead to a complete collapse of the food chain. Maybe not enough to starve off these higher trophic levels. In contrast to the shortwave response, the longwave response acts quite oppositely. So emitting all these aerosols acts more or less like a blanket around the Earth, much like greenhouse gases do, and it prevents the escape of longwave into space. And so in these different scenarios, here I'm showing the zonal average net longwave radiation at the surface through time since the time of the impact, and low values suggest less longwave being lost. And what I want to point you to is these high latitude regions, particularly in the dust and the soot cases, where the first winter or two in the high latitude regions after the impact, you actually have warmer winter temperatures than you would normally have under climatology. And so it's actually preventing that loss of longwave that you usually get in the winter months and keeping things relatively warm. So on a global scale, temperatures are already dropping quite quickly, but locally you can have some of the inverse responses here. And if you don't include these longwave trapping effects, your cooling is much more dramatic. And so you get extreme cooling if you don't consider the longwave effects as well as the shortwave. All right. So as you might expect, there's a significant longwave or significant temperature response due to these radiative perturbations. So here I'm showing the global average 2-meter temperature through time since the time of the impact. The greatest absolute cooling is due to the changes in the soot, about 17 degrees over the Earth's surface, even greater over land, about 10 to 11 degrees over the ocean. So extreme cooling that occurs pretty quickly. The duration of the cooling is a little bit longer for the SO2 emissions, again related to this longer atmospheric residence time of the sulfuric acid. And the dust only decreases temperatures by about 6 degrees C, but 6 degrees C within a few years is still extreme, and it would have been devastating for life on Earth. So here I'm just showing spatial maps of the cooling that we get in these different simulation scenarios. So here in this first plot I have the pre-impact climatology. Again, this fairly warm greenhouse climate state with a little bit of sea ice in the Arctic, but fairly warm temperatures overall. And then I'm showing the year of maximum deviation between this pre-impact climatology and the year of maximum cooling for soot, SO2, and dust. So just a few things to point out here is obviously the land is cooling a lot more than the oceans, as you might expect. And you also tend to get quite a bit of cooling in these shallow sea locations. And this is because you're going from a sea ice free area to one that's completely covered with sea ice within a few years. So you no longer have that air-sea interaction, and you get quite a bit of cooling there too. And overall, the patterns are fairly similar for the soot and the SO2. A little bit less cooling for the SO2 because you're still allowing some of that light into the surface, and that actually prevents cooling from being quite as extreme. Dust doesn't last nearly as long, and you're already starting to warm up within 1 year time period. So much less cooling there. If we again try to tie this back to how it might have impacted the life on Earth at this time period, we can look at things like freezing days and the upper ocean temperatures. So here I'm showing a combined plot, and hopefully it's not too terribly confusing, of the increase in the number of freezing days compared to the pre-impact climatology, and the minimum or the greatest amount of cooling in the upper 100 meters of the ocean. And so just a few things to point out here, mainly focusing on the soot and the SO2 responses, is there's very few locations on Earth that don't experience freezing after the soot emissions. There's only a few low latitude spots in these coastal regions that are able to not experience below freezing, at least for a single day. In contrast, the SO2 response is a little bit less. You actually have some sunlight still coming in at the low latitudes. There's many more areas for life to escape the freezing. However, if we look at the total number of increase in freezing days, there's actually kind of the opposite response, again due to the residence time of the aerosols, with the longer residence time of the SO2 leading to increase in the total number of freezing days in some of these mid-latitude and Antarctic regions. If we then focus on the ocean responses and the upper 100-meter cooling, we can see a very similar pattern for the SO2 and the soot responses, with the greatest cooling in the low latitude regions, in large part due to the reduction in the incoming energy, obviously just not heating things up much there. When we look at the higher latitude regions, we don't get nearly as much cooling in these areas. And this actually relates in large part to the increase in deep water formation, and I'll show that plot in a few minutes. But you're getting such an extreme increase in deep water formation in these high latitude regions that you're actually pulling this relatively warm water from the mid latitudes up into the high latitudes and keeping things from getting too cold there. And so even though a lot of these shallow seas become sea ice covered within a year or two after the impact, these high latitude open ocean regions stay more or less ice free throughout the impact event. All right. So moving on to some of the precipitation responses that we get. Here I'm just showing in the same fashion as before the global precipitation change through these different scenarios since the time of impact. And what you can see is that there's an extremely quick drop-off in the total precipitation. Maybe this isn't unexpected, but almost within a few days of turning off the lights at the surface, your convective activity goes to almost zero, particularly in the tropical regions. So your intertropical convergence zone collapses, and you get this really rapid drop in precipitation. And this persists for a long period of time, particularly in the soot simulations, before you get this period of wet deposition around year 6. So there's actually some interesting feedbacks that kind of keep this precipitation dampened, which I'm happy to talk about later. but a large component is really just the reduction in surface shortwave radiation. In contrast, the SO2, you're able to maintain extremely weak and sad Hadley circulation, a little bit of an intertropical convergence zone still occurring with the with the SO2 emissions, and so precipitation doesn't drop quite as much as you see in the soot and in the dust cases. And actually, even go 20 years out, there's actually still a small reduction in precipitation in the SO2 and the soot emission cases because the intertropical convergence zone is still a bit cooler than it was before. Your ITCC is still a little bit weaker. All right, so again, we can look at this spatially, and here I'm showing the lowest level winds of the atmosphere and the climatological precipitation for the control, the pre-impact climatology. Overall, as you'd expect, some fairly typical, easily identified features. You have a Walker circulation here, convection in the western equatorial Pacific, subsidence in the eastern equatorial Pacific, some dry zones in the subtropics due to the Hadley, these mid-latitude storm systems bringing moisture in those regions. You know, typical climate features, not really that different in the Cretaceous compared to present day to first order. If we look at the responses we get due to these different emissions, we pretty much collapse all the typical circulation patterns that you would expect. And so these are difference plots with the wind and the precipitation responses, the year of maximum precipitation reduction. And you can see you no longer really have strong Walker circulation. And since these are difference plots, it's not that the winds are actually strongly going from west to east along the equator. They've pretty much just weakened to almost zero. And so you don't have these strong gradients anymore. Your baroclinicity is extremely low. No mid-latitude storm tracks. Not much convection overall. But that doesn't mean that precipitation is lower than normal everywhere. And in particular, in some of these areas where you're used to having very dry climates, where you're used to having a lot of subsidence, you can actually get a small increase in some drizzle precipitation. And then there's a few areas where you have high contrast between the land and the sea in some of the high latitude regions that leads to a little bit of precipitation there. And these responses are a little bit more amplified in the SO2 response, due in large part to a little bit of additional heating that allows for a little bit more evaporation along some of these typical subsidence regions. All right, so if we again try to put this a little bit more into context, looking at how this might impact life on Earth, here I'm showing precipitation minus evaporation. And it's a somewhat different picture than you might expect based just on the precipitation response. So precipitation is decreasing almost everywhere on Earth, particularly in the soot scenario. But when we look at the change in precipitation minus evaporation, we get areas where we actually have a much greater moisture budget after the impact than before the impact. And this is due to the fact that you have a reduction in precipitation in these already dry areas, but you have significantly less evaporation as well. And so when you turn off the sunlight, you cool temperatures, your relative humidity shoots way up in a lot of these simulations. And you actually have the reduction in evaporation winning out over the decrease in the precipitation. And so overall, your moisture budgets lead to increased values. Obviously, this isn't the case where you have a lot of convected precipitation, or even in these mid-latitude regions a lot of times. So where your storm tracks are and where your ITCZ is significantly drier after the impact event than it was before, but that's not the case everywhere. And so we can kind of tie this in potentially with soil moisture and the post-impact fungal and fern spikes that are observed in a lot of different records. And just see that not everywhere really dried out after this impact event, even though we significantly reduced the precipitation. So here we have the pre-impact climatology, and this is just upper meter or so soil moisture from the model, and then comparing that against how much it changed in these different scenarios again. And just, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but really you can see that a lot of areas didn't really dry out that much. There's some variability between the different emission scenarios and how much drying there was. but all of them show areas where you actually increased your soil moisture after the impact event. So kind of a somewhat counterintuitive result possibly. All right, so finally, I want to talk a little bit about the potential longer term effects. So we only ran these simulations for 20 years each because with the current configuration, it's prohibitively expensive to run them for thousands or millions of years to more directly compare with some of these longer term geologic proxies, even though we're working on techniques to try and extend these run durations. But we can still kind of look at the initial results and try and see how they might have impacted things like the ocean over a longer period of time. And this is for more direct comparison with things like the ocean drill cores, where they have changes in the delta 13C, suggesting a long-term change in the carbon cycle for millions of years after the impact event. And so here I'm showing mixed layer depth as a proxy for where we're getting deep water formation. And so in the pre-impact climatology, we have a fairly sluggish overturning. Most of the deep water is occurring in the high southern latitudes. That's kind of typical of what you might expect for this period of time where you don't really have that much sea ice formation, et cetera. And then here I'm showing the difference in the mixed layer depth, kind of showing how much deep water is increased in these different scenarios. So I already mentioned that there's an extreme increase in deep water formation. It's increasing almost everywhere by quite a bit. If you compare the scales here between the pre-impact climatology and then how much larger these values are after the emission scenarios, it's really an extreme increase in deep water almost everywhere around the globe, particularly in the high southern latitudes where it was already fairly high. And this relates to both the cooling temperature. So you've decreased temperatures quite a bit. Obviously, that's going to cool the surface waters, lead to sinking. But also, you've decreased your precipitation quite a bit in a lot of these regions. So your freshwater flux from rivers and things like that is quite a bit less compared to climatology, where you actually had relatively warm and moist climate in the high latitudes. And so both these things interact to lead to extreme increase in deep water formation, particularly after the SO2 and the soot emissions. What this does is this drags water to depth that's relatively cool. And so for maybe 5 or so years, you have this invigorated overturning, but then the aerosols get removed from the atmosphere and things begin to warm back up again. And so your surface warms back up pretty quickly, as we showed in some previous plots. But if you look at your mid-layer ocean, it hasn't really warmed back up. And so you have this increased stratification that develops in these simulations that we haven't really run the simulations out enough to say how long it persists, but it could be important for nutrient upwelling and some type of prolonged disruption to the life on Earth. All right, just to kind of summarize my results and give a little bit of discussion and context about what I think were the most likely drivers of this end-Cretaceous mass extinction with respect to the impact winter. First of all, what we see generally is that soot has the largest perturbation to surface shortwave radiation, temperature, and precipitation. And so we're getting really the largest responses there. So if we had to pick one of these 3 emission scenarios as the most devastating to life, it would most likely be the soot emissions. And when we're trying to think about mechanisms for leading to extinction, it's easy to see several different extinction mechanisms playing out on land. You had the thermal pulse, you had the reduction in shortwave radiation, you had the cold temperatures. They all could have been very important. But the marine extinction is a bit trickier. So there was a die-off of a lot of these large marine reptiles as well as several other species, and it's not exactly clear why this occurred. And what we'd suggest here from these results is that if there were widespread soot emissions, it could have led to a collapse of the food chain. So even though dust is able to prevent photosynthesis at the surface for a month or so, only soot's really able to prevent photosynthetic activity for upwards of 2 years. And when you get to that longer period of time, you can actually begin to starve off the higher trophic levels. And so potentially the driver of this marine extinction relates to that. I know that some other people have put forward that maybe temperature was leading to this marine extinction, and really that could have been a driver in some low latitude places, but in the high latitudes we don't see a significant decrease in ocean temperature. And also ocean pH might have been important, but again, there's been some recent studies suggesting that the SO2 emissions weren't quite enough to really lead to dissolution of calcifiers. And finally, I just want to note that if we're looking for where things might have survived from this impact winter, we would recommend that the high latitude locations, these high latitude coastal areas, are probably the most resilient. One, they are already used to low light conditions throughout certain times of the year. They're used to larger seasonality. But in addition to that, these high latitude regions stay relatively warm. The precipitation doesn't decrease too much there. And so maybe that's where things were able to hide out and allow us to be here today, because otherwise it seems quite devastating. All right, so this is just a small part of the puzzle. As I mentioned, there's a large debate that still remains about, was the Deccan Traps an important player in this end-Cretaceous mass extinction? So we're trying to utilize this same model to try and simulate Deccan Traps eruptions. And it's a little bit tricky with the time scale of emissions from Deccan Traps, but we think we have a way to kind of incorporate that as well and compare the climate responses to these aerosols from the Chicxulub Impact event with the Deccan Traps volcanism. And also we're working to add ocean biogeochemistry to the model to get at things like pH, how quickly things could recover from this impact if the ocean stratification was important. And we can even begin to simulate the delta 13C and see if we can get this reduction in the vertical gradient that's thought to relate to the extinction and a change in the carbon cycle. So that's all I have, and I'd be happy to take any questions if you have them. Thank you.
Questions?
Can you go back to that surface ocean temperature plot? I didn't fully
Yeah.
grasp it in
This one?
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So are we showing changes of somewhere between 2 and 20 degrees in the upper ocean? Is that,
Yeah.
reading that correctly?
Right, yeah. So these areas are only about 100 meters deep or so. So these are shallow, very shallow, and they cool quite quickly. Whereas the open ocean doesn't cool quite as much, and the high latitudes are cooling the least because of the deep water increase.
So why wouldn't that just destabilize the water column and then you bring, I mean, the timescales, you're looking only at a few years here, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't then that destabilize the water column and then bring cooler water to the surface? So if this is the net over a few years, I mean, it's pretty impressive. It's a big
Yeah. I mean, I think there is some of that occurring in some of these low latitude areas to some extent, but it really seems that you kind of make this new kind of overturning circulation that's quite strong, and it's actually, you are getting a little bit of upwelling even occurring more in the equatorial region than you were before the impact event. And that water is getting dragged to higher latitudes, so the salinity increases in the high latitudes as well as that water is getting pulled down there.
And that's not enough to bring it to like extensive sea ice formation?
No, fortunately not. In these simulations, the high latitude regions around here, you're staying above freezing, so you don't even get sea ice formation there. Only in the shallow seas is it able to cool quickly enough and to extend the sea ice. And I should mention that the Arctic is fairly restricted at this time period, so you already have some seasonal sea ice in there before the impact event occurs. And so part of the reason why you're not getting any additional cooling there is you're already at freezing, so we're very close to. So you're only getting a degree or two cooler. Yeah.
So if you have an increase in the creation of very cold ocean water, and you have a suppression in convection, so water vapor is not as readily available in the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide would seem to be an uptake process. It's moving into deeper water. Is it really the soot that's causing this problem, or is it the greenhouse effect going away by removing greenhouse gases?
Causing
In other words, you're taking away a couple of really important greenhouse gases.
Right.
Especially
Well,
water vapor.
Well, actually, I mean, water vapor does decrease somewhat, but saturation gets very high as well. So you're not really raining out things as much. And something that I didn't really touch on here is that the inversion that develops, maybe I have it. Yeah, the inversion that develops due to the soot actually, while it allows more water vapor to reach the upper levels of the atmosphere, and the lower levels, you get eventually to this inversion that reaches down, or it's basically, your tropopause is sinking very close to the surface, and your relative humidity and your water vapor stay pretty high there. So you're almost at saturation before you get this wet deposition event. And so you still have quite a bit of water vapor after these type of scenarios. Yeah. Yep.
You may have shown it. I'm wondering about the light dimming on a latitudinal basis. Did you have that?
I don't think I have that one here.
Maybe you could just say what you remember if you do.
Yeah. So it doesn't take very long for it to reach the whole globe. So this is the Longwave. But we're emitting a lot of these materials, especially like the SO2 is over the whole globe all at once. And so the response is global pretty quickly. It's not like it's slowly dimming in certain areas. The soot's emitted over all land surfaces where we have vegetation. And so that takes a little bit longer to fill up the globe, but really it doesn't take that long at all for it to become more or less uniform. And if we look at the response, I don't unfortunately have it here, or how long it takes for certain things to recover. We breached that 1% photosynthetic threshold in the low latitudes first, but then there's a more rapid recovery in the high latitudes. And the exact mechanisms for that aren't especially clear, but it might have to do with the stratospheric circulation patterns. And you get some very strange stratospheric overturning once you have this layer of soot there. It almost acts as the new surface, and so there's some interesting dynamics there that we really haven't explored maybe as much as we should have. But there is, some interesting processes there and where you get the return of light first.
This is sort of indicating fewer days in the high latitudes, if I'm reading this correctly.
Yeah.
Upper left.
Yeah, in the high latitudes as well as in the low latitudes. Yeah. And there might be some climate dependence on this as well. When we did simulations with the pre-industrial climate state, it came back in the high latitudes first, which made more sense to us. And these ones we're also getting a return in the low latitudes as well. But I would say that the return in the high latitudes is more complete. The low latitudes gets above 1% more quickly, but it doesn't completely get rid of that soot as quickly. So when you talk about this wet deposition mechanism that takes place, hydration occurs in the high latitudes first, and you get that washout first. I think this is just a bit of, because you have so much more energy at the low latitudes, a bit more to be able to poke through or something like that. Yeah.
Matt, you have some remote questions?
Yes, I have a question from Ken Miller. It says, your models use Woebach's estimate of 70 gigatons of soot. If so, doesn't that imply only 5 to 10% burning of planetary biomass?
That's 70, well, I'm using 70,000 teragrams of soot, and that's assuming almost complete burning of the biomass. So these are updated estimates from Wendy Woebach's numbers, and those were coming from suggesting a complete burning of the biomass. So this is almost a complete burning. They aren't calculated actually from the model, so what we could do is we could go in and look at the biomass that the model is simulating and using those numbers instead of her estimates based on the amount of combustion you would need for the values found in these sedimentological records. And I will say is that, even if we only burn a fourth as much of the biomass, we get a very similar response as I had mentioned. Whoops. So here, and it might be a little bit difficult to see, but this is just the two simulations, one with the complete burning of the biomass estimate in blue here, and one where we only emitted a quarter the amount of soot. And the responses are very similar. And that's because the soot's able to loft up into the upper atmosphere, and you kind of reach this threshold where a lot of it kind of coagulates and condenses out. But that is able to reach the upper atmosphere can hang around there for a long time. So you don't even have that much differences, even though there are some large uncertainties, I'll acknowledge, about how much biomass actually burned at this time. Yep.
So in any of your results, do you see anything that you could connect to anoxia in the ocean?
Yeah. I'm hesitant to do it with the 20 years of data that we have, so not necessarily, but hopefully we can run the ocean potentially semi offline or something for a longer period of time to see that. And in these simulations, we didn't have ocean biogeochemistry on, so we can't get at the actual oxygen level. We could calculate it offhand, some simple metrics. I would suspect we should see some, but I don't know how long it would take for it to recover. I don't expect we could get these long-term signals that they found in some of these records. It just doesn't seem like the model is going to want to stay that stratified for that long of a period of time. But that's just speculation at this point. Yeah.
Any other questions?
You said a question.
Yeah, sure.
The sulfur.
Yeah.
The sulfur that you described was based on the impact, not on the volcanism, or both?
No, nothing from the volcanism in these simulations. So
The
it's,
extra sulfur.
yeah, that would be a whole different sulfur.
That could be a lot more sulfur.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, but this amount of sulfur is so high that it seems like it's actually more than they've estimated from the Deccan traps. And so the only thing I can really see for the Deccan traps being more important for the extinction is just the duration somehow, or the combination of CO2 and sulfur emissions in sequence leading to it. But overall, when looking at these numbers, and I mean, I didn't come up with them, so I kind of have to take them on faith somewhat. It really seems like the impact event should be the major driver of the extinction, from what I've seen. And I haven't done those simulations yet, so maybe I'll find something surprising, and I'm happy to find it. But
There's some evidence from Keller, you probably know,
yeah,
her work,
yeah.
that the volcanism had started earlier.
Yeah, and I mean, there's 2 papers that just came out in Science on this topic, and they had somewhat different results, but I think both of them really were suggesting that the majority of the volcanism occurred after the impact now. So there's some people that claim that destabilization was important, but I don't know. I don't buy that just CO2 increase alone would necessarily lead to, like, over 1 million years would be enough to lead to something like this. And there's a lot of evidence that there was a pretty abrupt extinction there at the boundary. The only thing I can think is maybe it somehow made life a bit more stressful early on. But the post-impact Deccan traps invigoration is an interesting idea that maybe could have helped lead to a prolonged extinction. Yeah.
Anyone else? All right, well, let's thank Clay again.
Thank you.